I have the information you need, but you must act now.
Imagine working every single day for 22 years, through failure, through loneliness, through missed birthdays and broken marriages and nights where you were not sure the whole thing would survive until morning. And then one Tuesday in October, a wire clears, a number appears in an account with your name on it, and the total is $340 billion. $340 billion. And then imagine that the very next morning, before the sun has fully risen over the city, before your own children even know the deal has closed, you pick up the phone and you call your banker, and you give him instructions. Instructions so specific, so calculated, so permanent that his legal team will spend the next 18 months trying to find a way to reverse them. Instructions that your three children, your own flesh and blood, will spend the next 3 years trying to forgive you for. And those instructions are simply this: give it all away. Every single dollar, every cent, nothing kept. Not for yourself, not for your children, not $1 placed into a trust with your name on it, not one investment made on your behalf, not one account left open with your name attached to it. Just gone. All of it, into the world, on purpose, by a man who had thought about this moment for 3 years before it arrived, and who executed it with a calm that would unsettle everyone who witnessed it. This is that story, and I promise you, you have never heard anything like it. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Before we get into who this man was, before we get into where he came from, and what he built, and what he saw, and what he ultimately decided, I want you to sit with that for just a moment. $340 billion. Gone. The morning after. By choice. By design. By a plan that had been years in the making, assembled in secret, executed with a precision that would take 18 months of legal review to fully understand. The question that is going to follow us through this entire story is not how he did it. The how is actually the straightforward part. The question, the one that changes everything, the one that his daughter spent 3 years trying to find an answer to, the one that a Harvard Business School professor has been asking her students every semester since the case was introduced into the curriculum, is why. And I will tell you right now, Wani, before we go a single step further, the answer is not what you think it is. It is not guilt. It is not a terminal diagnosis. It is not a tax strategy or a financial maneuver dressed up in moral language. It is not a breakdown or a crisis of faith or a late-life collapse into some ideology that the people around him could not follow. It is something far more specific than any of those things. It is something that began in a small Ohio town in 1963, in a house where a man worked himself to exhaustion for 31 years and received almost nothing in return. And it is something that ended in the life of a cleaning supervisor whose name most of the world will never know, who picked up her phone one Thursday morning in November and saw a number in her bank account that she was absolutely certain was a system error. It was not a system error. It was a man paying a debt he had been carrying for 22 years. And this is how it happened, from the very beginning to the very end. Before we get deeper into this story, we would love to hear from you right now. Drop a comment below and let us know where you are watching from. It does not matter if you are in Ohio or Texas or Georgia or California or anywhere else in the world. We genuinely love hearing from this community, and every comment means something to us. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We have stories coming that you do not want to miss. Now, let us go all the way back to the beginning, because to understand what James Calloway did on the morning of October the 14th, you have to understand who James Calloway was before the money existed. You have to go back to a city called Youngstown, Ohio, in 1963, to a street called Garfield Avenue, to a house that was clean and modest and cold in the winters because the heating bill was always something that had to be weighed against other things. You have to go back to a man named Harold Calloway, who worked the floor at a steel fabrication plant for 31 years and never once complained about it in the presence of his children. And you have to understand, truly understand, not just hear, what James watched his father become over those 31 years. Because that is where this whole story starts. That is the root of everything that follows. Harold Calloway was not a bitter man. That is important to say right at the beginning because it would be easy and in some ways emotionally convenient to paint him as a casualty, a victim of an America that chewed up working men and left them with nothing. But Harold was not bitter. He was proud. He was the kind of man who polished his work boots on Sunday nights and set them by the door for Monday morning. He was the kind of man who showed up early and left late and never asked for anything beyond what he had clearly earned. He believed with a sincerity that was almost devotional that if you worked hard and kept your head down and treated people right, the country would take care of you. He believed this not because he had been naive about the world, but because the world he had grown up in the 1940s and 1950s in the industrial Midwest, had offered enough evidence to support the belief. Men like Harold had built that evidence through generations of showing up and delivering and asking for nothing dramatic in return. Harold carried that inheritance and that belief into his 31 years on the factory floor. And by every measure he could see and access, he honored it. He had a house. He had a wife, Margaret, who kept that house with an attention to detail that made it feel like a home, regardless of what the bank account contained. He had 2 sons. The older one, Robert, was steady and quiet and followed a path not unlike Harold's own. The younger one was James, and James, from the time he was old enough to pay attention to anything at all, was paying attention to his father. James Calloway was not the kid who played sports or got into trouble or coasted through school on personality and charm. He was the kid in the corner of the room who was watching everything with a quiet, almost uncomfortable intensity and filing it all away somewhere deep. His elementary school teachers used words like observant and self-contained. His middle school teachers said he was serious in a way that was unusual for his age. His mother, Margaret, used to say, not unkindly, that James was born 40 years old. And what she meant by that, what she was observing without having the full language for it, was that James had arrived in the world already carrying something, already measuring things, already aware, in some pre-verbal and then increasingly verbal way, of the distance between what was promised and what was delivered, between what people deserved and what they actually received. And the specific gap he was measuring from his earliest years was the gap between what his father deserved and what his father got. Because Harold Calloway worked harder than almost anyone James would ever meet in his entire life. Harold Calloway was more consistent, more reliable, more decent, more present in his obligations than almost anyone James would encounter in 50 years of professional life. And Harold Calloway ended up with less, far less, humiliatingly less, than the quality of his effort and his character warranted. And that gap, that specific and personal and quietly devastating gap, became the organizing engine of the next 5 decades of James Calloway's existence. Everything else is commentary on that central fact. Harold retired in 1988, 31 years at the plant. His pension was $812 a month. Plus, he had a small savings account that he had maintained with care over the years, never spending frivolously, always setting something aside for a future that was now here. He had the house on Garfield Avenue, paid off. He had a collection of fishing lures kept in a tackle box in the garage that he almost never used anymore, because his knees had gotten to the point where standing on riverbanks for any length of time was more pain than pleasure. He was 63 years old. He looked, to the honest eye, closer to 75. James, by 1988, was 25 years old and already pulling away from Youngstown towards something he could feel more clearly than he could name. He drove home for his father's retirement party, a small gathering in the backyard of the house on Garfield Avenue, and neighbors and cousins and a few men Harold had worked alongside for decades. A sheet cake from the local grocery store, paper plates, plastic cups, and he stood in that backyard and he watched Harold shake hands and smile and say, "Thank you, it was a good run." 31 years went fast. And James felt something change inside him. Not anger exactly, not even grief in the most common sense of the word. Something more precise than either of those things. The feeling of watching a man receive the exact wrong compensation for exactly the right quality of life. Harold Calloway had given 31 years of his body, his time, his mornings and his evenings, and his knees and his lungs and his youth to a company that had already begun laying off workers in quiet anticipation of the decade that was coming. And the send-off was a sheet cake from the grocery store and $812 a month. James drove back to Columbus that night after the party, and he did not sleep. He lay in his apartment and stared at the ceiling, and somewhere in those long, dark, quiet hours, the promise he had been making to himself since childhood, the one that had always been vague and ambient, the background noise of his entire interior life, sharpened into something with actual edges, something that could cut. He did not yet know what he would do with it, but he knew it was there, and it was not going anywhere. The promise, as clearly as it can be articulated from the outside, was this: he would build something that could not be taken away, something that mattered in the way his father's 31 years should have mattered but didn't. When it was built, he would decide, deliberately, honestly, without self-deception, what it was actually for, not what it looked like it was for, not what the press releases and the board presentations and the valuations said it was for, what it was actually, fundamentally, honestly for. Who did it serve? Whose life was different because it existed? And was the difference worth the cost of building it? Those questions were present in James Calloway's mind from the retirement party in the backyard on Garfield Avenue in 1988. They were still present, still unanswered to his satisfaction, when he picked up the phone on the morning of October the 14th, 22 years later. The entire arc of this story, the company and the marriages and the notebooks and the phone call and the $340 billion, is the arc of a man trying to answer those questions honestly and discovering at the end of 22 years of trying that the honest answer required something that almost no one around him was prepared for. James enrolled at Ohio State in the fall of 1979. He was the first member of his immediate family to attend a four-year university. Harold drove him to campus in the family's 1974 Ford pickup truck, the same truck Harold drove to the plant every morning, and helped him carry 2 cardboard boxes of belongings up 3 flights of stairs to a dormitory room that was approximately the size of a large closet. Harold shook his hand at the door and said 4 words. He said, "Make it count." See, not make it big, not make it profitable, not make it impressive, make it count. Then Harold walked back down those 3 flights of stairs and got in the truck and drove back to Youngstown alone. James stood in the doorway of that dormitory room, looking at those 2 cardboard boxes, and felt the full weight of those 4 words settle on him in a way that they would never fully lift. Make it count. What does it count toward? What is it counting? Those were the questions. They were always the questions. They would be the questions for the next 40 years. He studied computer science and electrical engineering, and he did it with a quality of focus that his professors found unusual and occasionally unsettling. Not because he was the most naturally gifted student in his cohort. He was not. And he knew it and was comfortable with it, but because of the nature of his attention. He was not interested in being the most impressive person in any room. He was interested in understanding how systems worked at their foundations, how they failed, where the failures happened, and most importantly, who bore the cost of the failures. One of his professors, Dr. Raymond Cho, who taught infrastructure systems and who kept in touch with James for over 2 decades after graduation, later recalled in an interview that James had an almost clinical interest in the question of what technology cost the people it was supposed to serve when it did not work correctly. He said James was the only student he had in 30 years of teaching who would consistently redirect class discussions away from what a system could do and toward what happened to people when the system did not do it. He said, "Most students want to build things that work. James wanted to understand what broke and who it broke for. That is a different question. It leads to different work. It led, in his case, to a different company than most of his classmates built, and ultimately to a different decision about what to do with that company." He graduated in 1983 and took a position at a mid-sized technology firm in Columbus. He spent 2 years there doing work that was, by objective measure, below his developing capabilities. His colleagues assumed he was marking time. He was not marking time. He was studying. And he was watching how a company made decisions from the inside. The meetings where corners got cut and the rationale was always the same. The clients who got treated as revenue sources rather than as partners. The employees who absorbed costs that the company's financial model never officially acknowledged. He was filing it all away. In 1985, he left and did independent consulting work for 18 months, during which time he also began filling legal pads in the evenings with something that was not quite a business plan and not quite a mission statement and not quite a map, but was elements of all three. A map of a gap in how government agencies and mid-sized public institutions manage their data and communications infrastructure. Saw a gap that existed because the work was complicated and the clients were difficult and the timeline to profitability was long, and the margins were not the kind that attracted the investors who were making noise in the technology sector in the mid-1980s. James found the gap interesting for exactly those reasons, because the gap was real and the people inside it were real, and nobody with resources was trying to fill it. In 1987, before the company existed, before any of the money existed, before any of the success that would eventually arrive, James Calloway spent 3 months in eastern Kentucky. This is the part of the story that has never appeared in any business profile ever written about him. It is the part that does not exist in any official biography. It is not mentioned in the company's history, was not referenced in any of the speeches he gave in the years when people asked him to give speeches, not included in the version of himself that he presented to the professional world for 22 years. It appears in exactly 2 places in any public record. In a deposition filed during the legal proceedings that followed October the 14th, where his former chief financial officer mentioned it almost parenthetically as something James had once told him privately as context for a set of vendor decisions that had puzzled the CFO at the time, and in the notebooks. Those 3 months in eastern Kentucky are, in a very real sense, the entire story. Everything else, the company, the money, the phone call, the $340 billion, is the consequence of 3 months in Leslie County, Kentucky in 1987. That is where this whole thing begins and ends. That is the hinge. Leslie County, Kentucky is one of the most persistently economically distressed counties in the United States. It was distressed before James arrived, and it remained distressed after he left, and it has remained distressed in the decades since. The coal industry that had once organized economic life in that part of Appalachia had been contracting for years before 1987, and what had replaced it was mostly an absence of employment, of investment, of the kind of institutional infrastructure that most Americans in most parts of the country had come to take entirely for granted. The communications infrastructure in the community where James spent those 3 months was not merely outdated. It was, in technical terms, decades behind the standard that existed in comparable American communities. Residents could not reliably access medical information, government services, educational resources, or the basic connective tissue of modern civic life. The gap was not metaphorical, it was literal and measurable, and it had real consequences for real people every single day. James was there as part of a volunteer initiative organized through a coalition of technology professionals who were attempting to install basic communications infrastructure in underserved rural communities. He slept in a borrowed room in a farmhouse. He worked during the days on the technical installation. He ate dinner in the evenings with the family whose home he was staying in. A grandmother named Dorothy Burton, her daughter Patricia, and Patricia's 3 children, and her 2 boys and a girl ranging in age from 7 to 14. And he sat on the porch in the evenings after dinner, and he listened. He listened to Dorothy talk about what the county had been when she was young and what it had become. He listened to Patricia talk about what she wanted for her children and what the realistic options looked like and the distance between those 2 things. He talked to people in the community, not in a formal research capacity, not with a clipboard or an agenda, just as a young man from Ohio who was paying attention. And what he heard over and over again, in different voices and from different angles, was the same thing. That the America that everyone was supposed to have access to had drawn a line somewhere. And the line ran just outside of places like Leslie County. And the people inside the line had made their peace with it or were trying to. And the people outside the line had almost nothing to do about it except watch. He left after 3 months. He got in his car and drove back north, and he told himself he would come back. He told himself clearly, explicitly, in the kind of interior language that feels like a commitment when you make it. When I have built something, I will come back and I will use it for this. I will use it to fill this gap, or a gap like this, Or the 10 gaps underneath this gap that I can already see from here. He meant it when he said it. The intention was real, and the feeling behind it was real, and the memory of Dorothy Burton's porch in the evenings was real. And then he went back to Columbus, and he built the company. And the company consumed everything. And 1987 became 1991, and 1991 became 1998, and 1998 became 2005, and he had not gone back. He had not returned to Leslie County. He had not looked up Patricia Burton or her children or Dorothy. He had kept the memory somewhere, carefully preserved, but also somewhere that the daily demands of building a company made it possible to not reach for. And every year he told himself the same thing. When this quarter is done, when this contract closes, when this problem is solved, when the company reaches the next stage, then I will go back. Then I will do something that counts in the way I told myself I would. And every year the quarter ended, and the contract closed, and the problem got solved, and something else was already beginning. And the going back did not happen. For 20 years, the going back did not happen. The Calloway Systems Group was incorporated in the spring of 1991. James was 28 years old. The founding team was 4 people. James, an engineer named David Tran, who had been his colleague at the mid-sized firm and who would remain with the company for its entire existence. A woman named Sharon Mullen, who had spent 5 years doing government contracting work and who understood the procurement process in ways that James recognized as essential, and a recent Ohio State graduate named Kevin Brooks, who was technically gifted and willing to work for less than the market would eventually demand of him because he believed what James was describing was real. Those 4 people in a leased space on the east side of Columbus in the spring of 1991. That was the beginning. That was the whole thing at the start. The rejection letters began arriving almost immediately. James had assembled a pitch that was technically sound and that addressed a real and demonstrable market need. And that pitch went to 43 venture capital firms between 1991 and 1993. All 43 said no. The reasons varied in their specifics but shared an underlying logic. The market was too unsexy, the clients were too difficult, the timeline to meaningful returns was too long, the space too unglamorous to attract the kind of follow-on investment that would be needed to grow at a rate the firms considered worth their involvement. James listened to every rejection. He asked follow-up questions in every meeting where the firm was willing to have them. He kept every letter in a filing cabinet, numbered in the order they arrived, and he did not keep them as motivation in the conventional sense. The idea that rejection is fuel has always struck careful observers of James Calloway as too simple a framing for how he processed things. He kept them because they were data. Each rejection told him something about how people with capital thought about the problem he was addressing, and their consistent inability to see what he was seeing told him something important. The gap was deeper and more invisible than even he had thought, which meant the need was greater, which meant the work, if he could figure out how to sustain it without their money, was more important, not less. He found other ways to sustain it. The early contracts were small, scrappy, and hard-won. Government agencies at the regional level with specific problems and limited budgets. Educational institutions trying to modernize infrastructure that was already years behind. Healthcare networks attempting to create connectivity between facilities that had never been designed to communicate with each other. None of these contracts were glamorous. All of them were genuine. The company's first year of operations produced revenue that would make a modern observer laugh. It was a number that barely covered salaries and rent. The second year was modestly better. The third year included the first contract that suggested the company might actually become something sustainable. By 1995, 12 employees in the first significant federal contract won through a competitive process that took 11 months from initial proposal to award. Patricia Howell, the director of the agency office that awarded that contract, later described the experience of working with James Calloway as the most professionally disorienting of her career, and not for any negative reason. She said, "Every vendor we had ever worked with came in and told us what our problem was, and then sold us the solution they had already built for the problem they had decided we had." James spent 3 weeks doing nothing but listening. He met with the staff who use the systems every day, the intake clerks, the data processors, the people on the phones, people whose opinions on the technical infrastructure had never been solicited by anyone. And then he went away and he came back with a solution to the problem those people actually had. She shook her head, recalling it. She said, "It sounds so simple. It is so simple, but nobody does it. He did it, and it worked." When the federal contract led to 3 more within 18 months, the company's reputation in its specific corner of the government technology sector began to build. A reputation based not on scale or on marketing or on the kind of high-profile visibility that attracted coverage, but on the quality of what Callaway Systems delivered and on a culture within the company that the people who worked there described consistently in the same terms: honest, demanding, fair, and organized around the idea that the work actually mattered. That last element, the sense that the work actually mattered, was something James cultivated deliberately and maintained with a consistency that became the company's most powerful internal asset. Every new employee received in their first week a document James had written himself that described what the company was for. Not what it did, not its technical capabilities or its market position or its growth targets. What it was for, who it served, what the world looked like for the people and institutions that depended on the infrastructure Callaway Systems built and maintained. The document was updated every 3 years. It never became shorter. It became more specific each time, more precisely focused on the human reality behind the technical work. Current employees who were with the company from its early years and who have spoken about it since the events of October the 14th have said almost uniformly that the document was unusual in a way that they came to understand only in retrospect. James was not trying to motivate his workforce with abstract corporate values. He was trying to make sure that the people building the infrastructure understood whose lives it affected. That was the whole point. It always had been. By 1998, 280 employees, offices in Columbus, Washington, and Atlanta, revenue that had crossed the threshold from interesting to significant. By 2001, the technology sector was reeling from the collapse of the internet bubble, and companies that had been celebrated as world-changing were disappearing at a rate that made the business press sound like a disaster dispatch. Callaway Systems Group barely registered a tremor, not because James was lucky, though he had made decisions that looked prescient in retrospect, but because the company had never been built on the logic of the bubble in the first place. It had been built on filling a gap that existed independent of market enthusiasm, that did not require a particular economic climate to remain necessary. Government agencies still needed their data managed. Healthcare networks still needed their systems integrated. Educational institutions still needed their infrastructure maintained. The work that Callaway Systems did was not glamorous enough to have attracted bubble money in the first place, and therefore the bubble's collapse did not reach it. 3 of James's former classmates from Ohio State called him in the aftermath of the collapse. He listened to each of them describe what had happened. He did not say, "I told you so." He had not, in fact, told them anything. He had simply been building something else. He married Catherine in 1993. She was a litigation attorney from Cincinnati who had come to Columbus on a case and stayed connected to the city through professional relationships that kept drawing her back. They met at a dinner party, and the first thing James said to her was a question about how federal procurement regulations affected small technology vendors, which was, by any reasonable measure, not a romantic opening. But Catherine later said that what she noticed in those first minutes was the quality of his listening. She said he asked the question, and then he listened to her answer with a completeness that she was not used to encountering in social settings. She said most people ask questions as a way of organizing the space before they say the thing they actually wanted to say. She said James asked questions because he wanted to know the answer. She found that unusual enough to be interesting. They were married in the spring of 1994 in a small ceremony in Columbus. Their daughter Rachel was born in 1995, their son Daniel in 1997. The family occupied a house in a quiet Columbus neighborhood that was comfortable without being extravagant, chosen by James with a practicality that Catherine found both admirable and, in time, slightly suffocating. She had grown up in a family that understood the symbolic dimension of things, the way choices about how you lived communicated something about who you were and what you valued. James did not think about things that way. He thought about function. He thought about what was sufficient, The house was sufficient. He did not think about it beyond that. This difference in orientation, the gap between Catherine's understanding of life as partly symbolic and James's understanding of it as almost entirely functional, was one of the fracture lines that opened slowly over 9 years and eventually became too wide to bridge. The marriage ended in 2002. The ending was not dramatic. There was no catastrophic event, no single moment that could be identified afterward as the turning point. There was a growing distance that Catherine found impossible to close, and that James, as she described it in later years with a careful and fair-minded precision, seemed genuinely unable to perceive. She said she never doubted that he cared about her. She was explicit about that. She said the thing she came to doubt was whether he knew how to be present in the sustained, ordinary, a daily way that a marriage required, present not for the important occasions, but for the Tuesday evenings, for the conversations that did not have an agenda, for the being there that is not about any specific thing, and that is, for many people, the entire substance of a life shared with another person. James was somewhere else during those Tuesday evenings. He was always somewhere else, even when he was physically in the room. And the somewhere else was always the company, or more precisely, the question underneath the company. The question of what it was for, what it was counting toward, whether he was on track to make it count the way his father's 4 words had asked him to. Catherine could not reach that place and eventually stopped trying. And the divorce was handled quietly and with a mutual civility that spoke to the fact that they had arrived at the same diagnosis, even if neither of them had been able to prevent the outcome. Their 2 children, Rachel and Daniel, lived primarily with Catherine in Columbus. James was present for the important occasions and absent for the ordinary ones, which is a way of describing a category of father that is neither fully good nor fully bad, and that leaves a particular kind of mark on children that takes years to fully map. He married again in 2004. Her name was Linda. She was a structural engineer from Dallas who had come to Columbus on a project and stayed. She was 12 years younger than James, practical and direct and possessed of a healthy impatience with abstraction that James found attractive because it pushed back on something in him that needed pushing back on. She was clear about what she wanted, clear about what she expected, and clear about the fact that she understood she was marrying a man who was primarily defined by his work and who would require ongoing negotiation in order to also be a husband. She thought, when she accepted those terms, that she was being clear-eyed. She was. She simply discovered over 9 years that the negotiation never actually produced what she had imagined it would produce. The work did not diminish with success. The presence she had bargained for remained elusive. Their son Marcus was born in 2006. Linda later said in the one interview she gave on the subject that having Marcus changed James in visible but insufficient ways. He was more present for Marcus's infancy than he had been, by Catherine's account, for Rachel and Daniel's. He took mornings with Marcus. He came home for bedtime more consistently than his schedule had previously allowed. But Linda said the ceiling on his presence was still the company. Everything above that ceiling stayed there, and over time the ceiling was not high enough for what a family needs. The marriage ended in 2013. Linda's summary, delivered with a directness that was entirely in character, was, "He was married to the company. The rest of us were secondary. I knew it going in, and I thought it would change. It did not." 2013 was the year several things happened simultaneously in James Calloway's life that, looked at together, it constitute the beginning of the end of the story we are telling, or more precisely, the beginning of the final chapter. His second marriage ended. His daughter Rachel, then 18 years old, told him in a conversation that he has never described publicly, but that she has referred to obliquely in one interview, that she was not sure she recognized him anymore. Not as an accusation exactly, more as an honest observation from a young woman who had spent 18 years watching her father be thoroughly, consistently, and apparently contentedly absent from the interior of family life. He listened to her say it. He did not defend himself. He said, after a moment, "You might be right." And then he went back to work. And the company in 2013 had revenues approaching $2 billion annually and more than 1,000 employees and a reputation in its sector as indispensable in a way that private equity had been circling for years trying to find a purchase on. And James Calloway that same year began keeping the notebooks. The notebooks were small, black, standard, composition notebooks, the kind available at any drugstore for less than $2. He bought them in batches and numbered them on the spine in his own handwriting. He kept the current one with him almost everywhere. His assistant Brenda, who worked with him for 14 years, later said she saw him writing in them on planes, in waiting rooms, in the back of cars on the way to meetings, at his desk in the early morning before the rest of the office arrived. And she said the writing in the notebooks looked different from all the other work she observed him doing. It had a quality she struggled to name in her deposition. She tried several words before settling on the one she wanted. She said it looked like prayer, not in any religious sense, but in the sense of a man in a very private conversation with something very important. She said, "I never asked about them. It was clear they were private in a way that I respected." She said she never saw him share anything from them with anyone in the office. She said in 14 years she never read a single line of what he wrote in them, and she said that was not incidental. She said she understood, without being told, that those notebooks were not for the professional world. They were for something underneath it. And there were 27 notebooks over approximately 3 years. By the time the sale closed in October, there were 27 of them. 4 became part of the public record through the legal proceedings. Portions of those 4 were read into depositions. From those fragments, and from the accounts of people who read them in the context of the legal process, a picture emerges of a man conducting a sustained, serious, and unsparing private accounting. Not of the company's finances, of his own life. What was the company for? What had building it cost? What did he owe and to whom? What was the honest difference between building something significant and doing something meaningful? And was that difference reconcilable? Or had he spent 22 years discovering in slow motion that it was not? And if it was not, if the building of this company had required the sacrifice of exactly the things the company was always supposed to eventually enable, then what did honesty require of him at the moment when the building was complete? Not comfort, not self-forgiveness. Honesty. James Calloway was, if nothing else, and by every account of everyone who knew him well, a man who consistently and at personal cost preferred the honest answer. And the honest answer he arrived at, over 3 years of private writing in those composition notebooks, was going to cost him more than anyone in his life had imagined it could be possible for a person to voluntarily pay. In Notebook 3, the earliest of the 4 that entered the public record, written approximately 8 months after Harold Calloway died in March of 2009, there is a passage that James's attorneys later described as the document that most clearly illuminated the motivational architecture of everything that followed. Harold died in a hospital in Youngstown at 3 in the morning. James was on a plane. He was flying back from Chicago, where he had been in meetings, and the flight had been delayed due to weather, and he had been receiving updates on his father's condition throughout the day and into the evening. The updates had been, until approximately midnight, cautious but not desperate. And then somewhere over the flat dark of the Midwest, with his phone in airplane mode because the airline required it, and he had complied without thinking twice about it because compliance with procedural rules was deeply ingrained in him, Harold Calloway's condition changed rapidly, and then it was over. See, James landed at Columbus at 4:15 in the morning and turned on his phone, and the screen filled with missed calls, and he understood what they meant before he listened to any of them. He sat in the terminal for a long time. He called the hospital. He sat with the phone, and then he called back, knowing Harold's room phone would not be answered, and he left a voicemail into an empty room. The voicemail that no one would hear because the person it was meant for was already gone. No one has ever reported what he said in that voicemail. It has never been shared. It has never been referenced in anything James has said publicly. It exists only as an act of grief so private that its privacy has been honored even by the people who knew him best and who had professional access to details of his life that he never volunteered to anyone. In Notebook 3, 8 months after the terminal and the voicemail, in the drive from Columbus to Youngstown in the early morning, he wrote this: "My father gave 31 years of himself to a company and to a country that measured his contribution at $812 a month in a sheet cake in a backyard. I was on a plane reviewing revenue projections when he died alone in a room at 3 in the morning. The plane and the projections were for something I had been telling myself for years he would eventually benefit from. He did not benefit from it. He died before it arrived, and it was not coming for him anyway. Or if that is the deal, if building something significant means arriving at your father's death on a plane in airplane mode because the airline said to put your phone away and you complied, then I need to understand what a different deal looks like. Not a better version of the same deal. Not the same deal with a higher number at the end. A different deal, different terms, different accounting. What does it cost and who pays and what do you get for it and who gets to benefit from it this time? I think I am starting to understand what the different deal looks like. I do not think it will be comfortable. I think comfortable is what the same deal offers. The different deal offers something that I do not have a word for yet, but that I know I have been living without for a very long time. When he had been working with a separate legal team since 2014, a firm in a different city from any of the firms that managed his company or his personal finances, retained under a confidentiality arrangement so thorough that no one in his immediate professional circle had any awareness of the engagement. Not Gregory Park, his chief financial officer of 11 years, not his board, not Brenda, not his personal tax attorneys. The engagement was clean and separate and contained. The way James organized things he was serious about. The purpose of the engagement was the design and legal architecture of what he was going to do with the proceeds of the sale that he had already decided. By 2014, he was going to execute within the decade. The sale had not yet been negotiated. The buyer had not yet been identified. But the destination of the proceeds had been determined. 3 years before the money arrived, James Calloway knew exactly where it was going. The legal work was in the design of how it would get there, in the most efficient, most legally durable, most irreversible way possible. Irreversibility was important to him. He was not interested in a structure that could be challenged and unwound. He wanted it done in a way that was permanent. He was paying a debt that was long overdue, and he was paying it in full, and he was paying it once, in a way that could not be recalled. The list of recipients took 3 years to build. James constructed it the same way he constructed everything, methodically, with research, with attention to the specific reality of the people and institutions on it, without sentimentality, but with genuine care. He used the knowledge he had accumulated over 22 years of working in exactly the sectors where the gaps were most damaging: government services, healthcare infrastructure, education, rural communications, veteran services. He knew where the needs were. He had spent 2 decades building infrastructure in the spaces around those needs without ever being able to directly address the needs themselves. Now he was going to address them directly. The list was long. The amounts were specific and calculated. The rationale for each recipient was documented in the notebooks with a precision that would later both impress and unsettle the attorneys who reviewed it. He had not been impulsive. He had not been emotional in the way people use that word to mean irrational. He had been, and as Gregory Park would later say with a kind of awed disorientation, executing a plan. He had been executing a plan that none of them knew existed, for a goal that none of them had been invited to understand, over a period of years that none of them had been able to see. Gregory Park said, "I worked with this man for 11 years. I thought I understood how he operated. What those documents revealed was that there was an entire other company running inside him, and the product of that company was this. And we had no idea. The consortium that purchased Calloway Systems Group, a private equity group based in New York with deep holdings in the government technology sector, first made contact with James in 2014. He declined to engage. They returned in 2016. He agreed to exploratory conversations, which proceeded slowly and then stalled, soared then resumed, then stalled again, in a pattern that the consortium's managing partners found deeply frustrating. Internal communications from the consortium that were later made part of the public record reveal a team that understood they were dealing with an unusual negotiating counterpart, but could not fully characterize what made him unusual. One partner wrote that negotiating with James Calloway was like playing a game where your opponent had seen the final position before the game started and was simply waiting for you to arrive at it. Another wrote more simply, He is not negotiating price. I do not know what he is negotiating, but it is not price. They were right. James was not negotiating price. He knew the price he would accept. He had determined it based on what the company was worth by the metrics that mattered to him, which were not identical to the metrics that mattered to the consortium, but which overlapped sufficiently to make a deal possible. What he was negotiating were the conditions: employee protections, severance guarantees for staff at every level, benefit continuations, restrictions on layoffs for a defined period post-acquisition that were specific enough and binding enough that the consortium's labor attorneys flagged them repeatedly as unusual for a transaction of this size. The consortium assumed these conditions were optics. They were not optics. They were the second part of the debt James was paying, the part owed to the 1,000+ people who had built the company alongside him and whose futures he could protect at the point of sale in a way that the proceeds of the sale would not be available to protect after. The final negotiation took place over 4 days in a private hotel suite in Washington, D.C. in October. The atmosphere in the room, by multiple accounts of people present, was tense in the way that negotiations at this scale tend to be tense. Many things at stake, many people's interests represented, many hours of accumulated fatigue making everyone's edges sharper. James was, by every account, the calmest person in the room for all 4 days. His lead attorney, who had represented clients in dozens of major transactions over 30 years, said he had never seen anyone demonstrate that quality of stillness at the point of closing. He said James sat at the table and answered questions and responded to proposals with a clarity and a completeness that removed the usual friction from the process. But he said the consortium's team kept waiting for the moment when the real negotiation began, the moment when facades dropped and actual positions were revealed. That moment never came, not because James was concealing anything, but because he had known for 3 years what he was willing to accept, and the negotiation had simply been the process of establishing whether the consortium could meet his terms. And when they did, there was nothing left to negotiate. He signed the documents at 11:47 in the evening on a Sunday in October. He shook hands with the lead partner. He thanked the room. He picked up his coat. He walked out through the hotel lobby and through the revolving doors into the night air of Washington, D.C., and he was, at that moment, one of the wealthiest private individuals in the country. He had no intention of remaining so. Then he went back to his hotel room. He did not call his children. He did not call Gregory Park or any of his board members, or Brenda, or any of the other people who had been woven into his professional life for years. He did not call Catherine or Linda. He sat in his hotel room, still dressed, and he remained there through most of the night. His phone records show no outgoing calls between midnight and 6:12 in the morning. The room service records from the hotel show one order placed at approximately 1:30 in the morning, coffee and nothing else. He sat in his room with his coffee in the dark, and he did what he had always done with the most important things in his life. He thought it through alone, completely without interruption, until he was sure. And by 6:12 in the morning, he was sure. He had been sure for 3 years. And he had simply been waiting for the moment when the certainty could become action. The moment was here. He picked up the phone, and he dialed Thomas Reardon. Thomas Reardon had been James Calloway's personal banker for 11 years. He was a careful man, professional to his core, experienced with the financial affairs of people at the highest levels of private wealth. He was not easily surprised. He was sitting at his desk at his home office. It was 6:14 in the morning, early even for him, but he had learned over 11 years that James's calls respected no particular convention about appropriate hours. When his phone rang and the caller ID showed James's number, he answered. He said good morning. James said good morning. And then he said in the measured, sequential, in an unfiller way he always gave instructions. I want to talk through what happens next with the proceeds. Thomas said, of course, he had been expecting the call, and James began, and Thomas listened. And as James spoke, Thomas Reardon reached for a pen and wrote down the time on the notepad on his desk. 6:14 a.m. He wrote it down because something in the first 30 seconds of what James was saying made him understand that he was going to need a record of this. He did not know yet the full scope of what he was hearing, but he knew it was not what he had expected. And in 11 years of managing James Calloway's private finances, Thomas Reardon had trained himself to document the things that were not what he expected, because James was the kind of client whose surprises tended to have significant consequences. The instructions, as Thomas Reardon described them in his deposition 18 months later, were delivered in 5 sequential components. First, the full proceeds of the sale, $340 billion, were to be transferred out of his personal accounts within 60 days of the deposition date, which was already complete. Second, the recipients and transfer amounts had been established by the separate legal team, and the relevant documentation was in process of delivery to Reardon's firm. Third, no personal retention amounts were to be maintained. Fourth, no investment structures were to be created in his name. Fifth, his personal living expenses for the foreseeable future had been arranged through a structure that did not involve these accounts, the details of which Reardon would receive separately. Thomas asked at this point, whether he had heard the third item correctly. James confirmed it. Thomas asked him to confirm there was no personal retention amount of any kind. James confirmed it again. Thomas asked about his children. James said his children had been accounted for separately and that Reardon would receive documentation on that matter in due course as well. Thomas asked no more questions. The call ended at 6:20 and 40 seconds in the morning. 6 minutes and 40 seconds in total. Thomas Reardon wrote the end time on the notepad. He looked at the 2 times on the notepad for a long while. Then he looked at the window of his home office where the early morning light was coming in. Then he picked up the phone and called his firm's general counsel. The firm's legal team began their review immediately. They expected to find an error. They expected to find an ambiguity in the instructions, a technical imprecision, something that could be the basis of a conversation with James about what he actually intended as opposed to what he had literally said. They found nothing. The instructions were legally constructed with a precision that reflected, as they would later discover, 2 years of preparation by a separate legal team working specifically to ensure that the instructions were unambiguous, comprehensive, and durable against challenge. There was no error. There was no imprecision. There was no gap between what James had said and what James had meant. The legal team spent 72 hours looking. Then they stopped looking. Then they began the process of working out how to comply. Gregory Park found out on a Thursday morning, 4 days after the sale closed, when one of the attorneys called him to discuss the practical logistics of the transfers. He later described the phone call with the attorney as one of the most disorienting conversations of his professional life. He said the attorney had a quality of patient, careful, almost clinical neutrality in explaining what was happening that Gregory found more unsettling than any emotional delivery would have been. He said he asked the attorney to repeat certain items multiple times. He said he took notes and then looked at his notes and could not understand them, not because they were unclear, but because what they described was outside the frame of anything he had prepared himself to process. He said, "I have spent my career in finance at a level where large numbers are ordinary. The scale of what was described was not what disoriented me. What disoriented me was the intention behind it. I could not make it fit with anything I knew about how people think at this level. It did not fit. That was the thing. It simply did not fit anywhere in my experience. And the man I had worked with for 11 years had clearly understood that it would not fit and had not told me. That was what I sat with for a long time after the call. That he had known none of us would understand and had kept it from us not out of unkindness, but because our understanding was not, in his judgment, necessary for his purposes. And he was probably right. And knowing that he was probably right made it harder, not easier, to sit with." Rachel Calloway was 24 years old when she found out. She was contacted by her father's attorneys and asked to come in for a meeting at their offices. So she assumed it was about estate planning of some kind, a beneficiary designation, a trust structure, something that would require her to sit across from attorneys and sign documents and be told that her father had been prudent with his money and had made provisions. She was right that she would be sitting across from attorneys. She was right that she would be told something about money. She sat down and the lead attorney began to speak, and within the first 90 seconds, she knew that what she was hearing was not what she had expected. And within the first 3 minutes, she knew that the meeting was going to be one of the defining experiences of her life. She said nothing while the attorney spoke. She asked one question when he finished. "Is this reversible?" The attorney said no. She said thank you and she left the building and she sat in her car in the parking garage for 2 hours. She has described those 2 hours once in the single interview she gave on the subject, and she described them with a precision that suggests she has revisited them many times. She said the thing that kept returning to her in that parking garage was not the money, though the money was real and its absence from her future was real, and she was entitled to feel what she felt about that. The thing that kept returning was the silence, the years of it, the deliberate, sustained, protected silence of a man who had been making this plan for years, while sitting across from her at dinner tables, while showing up for birthdays, while calling on Tuesday evenings to ask how she was, and never saying a word. The planning and the silence felt, out to Rachel, like a second secret that existed beneath the first one, and it was the second secret that she sat with in that parking garage for 2 hours. Daniel Calloway was 21 years old. He received the news by phone from the attorney's office. He listened. He asked 3 factual questions. He thanked the attorney, a response he later described as reflexive and absurd, but the one his body produced. And then he called his father. The call lasted 40 minutes. Daniel has never spoken publicly about what was said during those 40 minutes. James has referred to it only as a conversation he is grateful they were able to have, without any further description. What is documented is that after the call, Daniel did not speak to his father for 14 months. Not in anger, and as Daniel has since indicated in conversations with people close to him. In a need for distance, a need to process something enormous in a way that required space he could not negotiate with his father present. James did not pursue contact during those 14 months. He gave Daniel the space without apparent resistance. Whether that was respect for Daniel's need or evidence of the distance that had always characterized James's relationships with the people closest to him is a question that only James and Daniel can answer, and neither of them has. Marcus was 12 years old. He was told by his mother Linda in a way that was calibrated for his age, an age-appropriate truth, honest but not exhaustive, one explaining that his father had made a decision about what to do with the money from the sale of the company that was different from what most people would expect. Marcus's understanding of the full implications of his father's decision has grown with him over the years since. He is now 20 years old. He has never spoken publicly about his father or about any of this. He has, by the accounts of people who know the family, a relationship with the story of his father's life that is still in the process of being formed. He is young enough that the final shape of that relationship is not yet visible. He has 12 years before the trust payment arrives. 12 years to decide what he thinks. 12 years inside a story whose meaning is still unfolding. That is not a small thing to carry at 20, and the legal challenge was filed 14 months after the transfers were complete. Rachel and Daniel, represented by a prominent estate litigation firm, filed a petition challenging the distributions on the grounds of diminished capacity. Their argument was carefully structured. The totality of the giving, combined with the secrecy of the planning and the speed of execution, constituted evidence of a mental state that should have precluded legal validity. It was not a frivolous argument. Attorneys who reviewed the petition and had no stake in its outcome said it was competent and addressed a genuine legal question. It was also unsuccessful. 3 psychological evaluations were conducted. 1 by experts retained by the children's legal team, 2 by experts retained by James's attorneys. All 3 concluded independently that James Calloway had been, at the time of the distributions and for the years of planning that preceded them, fully and demonstrably competent. Sound mind, clear and sustained intent. The planning itself, its duration, its sophistication, its internal consistency, was cited in all 3 evaluations as evidence in support of competency rather than against it. A person in a compromised mental state, all 3 evaluators noted, does not sustain 3 years of secret, legally sophisticated, internally coherent planning. The petition was denied. The distributions stood. They remained standing. Rachel's public statement after the denial was short and careful. She said she had been angry, she was sometimes still angry, and that was honest. She said she had gone to see her father and asked him to explain what he had done and why. She said he had explained it. She said she did not agree with all of it and still did not. But she said she understood it. And she said she had come to believe that understanding something and agreeing with something were very different things, and that it was possible to arrive at the first without the second. She said, "That is where I am." The statement was carefully made, and it was not enough to satisfy the public's curiosity about what, specifically, James had told her. She has not elaborated. The conversation she had with her father, the one that moved her from anger to something she called understanding, is something we have to reconstruct from other sources. One, because she has chosen not to share its private contents, and he has chosen not to speak publicly at all. But the reconstruction is possible. The pieces are in the record, and they produce a picture that is, when assembled, more coherent than the public coverage suggested and more human than the legal language of the proceedings could contain. The first piece of the explanation is Harold Calloway and the retirement party and the sheet cake and the $812 a month in the hospital in Youngstown at 3 in the morning and the voicemail into an empty room. That is the foundation. James had watched his father give everything to a system that returned almost nothing, and had promised himself that he would build something and then use what he built in a way that honored what his father deserved and did not receive. The building happened. The using, the actual using, the going back, the paying of the debt, had been deferred for 22 years by the demands of the building itself. His father died before it happened, and the death, and the circumstances of the death, and the voicemail removed from James the comfortable fiction that there was still time to do things in order, still time to build and then return, still time to keep the promise the way he had imagined keeping it. Harold's death collapsed the timeline, and into the collapsed timeline, James had poured 3 years of notebooks and a separate legal team and a list of recipients and a plan that was, by the time the sale closed, went as complete and irreversible as he had been capable of making it. The second piece is Leslie County. The 3 months in 1987, the Burton family, Dorothy on the porch in the evenings, Patricia and her 3 children, the community that existed entirely outside the infrastructure that most of America considered basic. James had told himself in 1987 that he would go back. He had not gone back. He had built a company that worked in the spaces around the problem he had seen in Leslie County, building infrastructure for institutions that serve people, making systems work for the people who depended on them. And he had told himself for 22 years that this was the same as going back. That building the company was building toward the solution, that the company was the mechanism by which the debt would eventually be paid. And then, while in the notebooks, he had been forced to confront the fact that this was not true. The company was not the mechanism. The company was the thing that made it possible to keep not confronting the fact that going back and building a company were not the same thing. In Notebook 17, he wrote, in a passage that was included in the deposition record, "I told myself I was building something that would eventually allow me to go back and do what was needed. That is not what happened. What happened is I built something that made it easier every year to believe that what I was doing was the same as going back. It was not the same. And the money was never going to make it the same. And the only thing that would make it the same was to stop carrying the money as a placeholder for the intention and to actually convert it into the thing the intention always pointed toward." The third piece is what he wrote in Notebook 23, approximately 6 months before the sale closed, in the passage that Rachel has cited as the sentence that began to move her from anger. He wrote, "The only currency I was ever actually building was time, and I spent it wrong for a long time. I cannot get it back, but I can stop spending the proxy. $340 billion. A proxy. A proxy for time, for presence, for going back to Leslie County, for sitting on Dorothy Burton's porch and being fully there, for being in the hospital in Youngstown at 3 in the morning when his father died instead of in an airplane in airplane mode over the flat dark of the Midwest. The money was never the point. The money was what you accumulate when you spend 22 years spending something else." And James Calloway, at 60 years old, with a sale closing in October and $340 billion about to clear into his accounts, had decided that the honest thing, the thing that cost what honesty costs, was to stop spending the proxy and send the proxy to the people it had always actually been meant for. Now let us talk about where the money went. because the list of recipients is the most specific and the most human part of this story, and it deserves the time it takes to understand it. The full list, mine as assembled by journalists and investigators and the legal process over approximately 2 years, contained 237 individual recipients and 41 institutional recipients. The geographic distribution was not random. When analysts mapped it, 43% of the total individual distributions went to people living in counties with the highest concentrations of long-term economic decline. Counties in Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia, Mississippi, Eastern Tennessee, the rural Midwest, the rural South. Counties that had been losing population and economic vitality for decades, and that rarely appeared in any news cycle unless a natural disaster made them temporarily visible. And these were the places James had spent 22 years building infrastructure around and had never been able to build infrastructure for directly. The institutional distributions followed a similar logic. A rural health clinic in Leslie County, Kentucky, the same county where James had spent 3 months in 1987, received funds sufficient to operate for 12 years without dependence on the grant cycles that had governed its existence since its founding. When the clinic's director was told the source of the funding and the reason for it, she reportedly sat very still for a long time and then asked the attorney who had delivered the news whether she could speak to James directly. She was told he had declined contact. She sent a letter. He has not publicly acknowledged the letter. The clinic is still operating. It has expanded its services twice since the funding arrived. A school district in rural Mississippi received funds for facility renovation and 5 years of teacher salaries. The district had been operating with a teacher vacancy rate that made comprehensive instruction nearly impossible. The science wing that was rebuilt with the funding had been closed for 4 years because the repair costs exceeded what the district's budget could accommodate. It reopened 18 months after the funding arrived. A veterans housing organization operating in 3 states received funds that allowed it to expand its capacity by nearly 3 times over 4 years, serving families that had been on waiting lists for periods that the organization's director described as unconscionable and unavoidable. It was no longer unavoidable. Doctor, where Angela Morris received funding for her research program at a small university in a mid-Atlantic state. She had been running her lab on grants so marginal that she had been unable to pay her graduate students at a rate that allowed them to focus fully on the research. She had been pursuing work on early-stage diagnostic technology for conditions that disproportionately affected low-income communities, conditions that were not glamorous enough to attract the major foundation funding that might otherwise have supported them. The Calloway distribution funded 5 full years of her work. It paid her graduate students. It funded her trials. It bought the time that research of that kind requires and that the conventional grant cycle almost never provides. Dr. Morris, who agreed to speak briefly on the record, said, "I had been told by the funding environment that the people I was trying to help were not a sufficient priority to receive sustained support. The money changed that. 5 years of not having to justify my existence to a grant committee every 12 months. I cannot fully describe what that means for the quality of the science. I can only tell you that we are further along than we would have been by a margin that I believe will eventually matter to people whose names I do not know yet. And then there is Sandra. Sandra is not her real name. Her real name has not been published and will not be published here because she has asked for privacy, and that request is entirely reasonable for a person who became, without any choice in the matter, part of a public story. Sandra had worked as a night cleaning supervisor at Calloway Systems Group's headquarters in Columbus for 11 years. She had been employed by a third-party facilities management company that held the cleaning contract for the building, which meant that she was not technically an employee of Calloway Systems Group, which meant that the employee protections that James had negotiated into the sale agreement did not apply to her directly. James knew this. He had known it when he designed the employee protections, and he had known it when he assembled the recipient list. Sandra appears on the recipient list with a notation in the documentation that references her 11 years of service, the third-party employment structure that excluded her from the direct protections, and a calculation of approximately 3,400 working days over the 11-year period. The wire transfer she received was exactly equal to $1,000 for each of those days. $3,400,000. She did not know it was coming. She did not know James Calloway knew her name. She had never met him. She had cleaned the floors of his building for 11 years on the overnight shift, and she had never been in the same room with him as far as she knew. She found out the way most of the individual recipients found out, through a notification from her bank that appeared on her phone one Thursday morning in November. She looked at the notification. She looked at it again. She called her bank. The automated system told her the balance in her account. So she called again and reached a representative. She asked whether the balance was correct. The representative confirmed the transfer. She asked again. The representative confirmed it a second time and mentioned that it was a wire transfer that had cleared the previous business day. She sat down on the floor of her kitchen. She called her daughter in Dallas. Her daughter, who has agreed to share this much of the story, said her mother's voice was unlike anything she had heard from her before. Not loud, almost quiet. She said her mother told her what had happened, and then she said, in a voice her daughter has described as something between amazement and grief, "Someone remembered that I was there." That is what she said. Someone remembered that I was there. And if you are looking for the sentence that most accurately captures what $340 billion became in the hands of James Calloway, that sentence is probably it. Someone remembered that I was there. Not the revenue projections, not the market analysis, not the valuation multiple. That. The 236 other individual recipients had their own versions of Sandra's Thursday morning. They are scattered across the map of American economic struggle. People who had worked, often invisibly, in proximity to the kind of wealth and institutional power that generates $100 billion technology companies, while the people who maintain the buildings and process the intake forms and drive the delivery vans remain formally outside the prosperity they help enable. James had been watching those people for 22 years. He knew who they were, not all of them individually, though Sandra he apparently did know individually, in the way that someone who pays attention to every floor they walk on eventually knows the people who make those floors clean. He knew their category. He knew where they lived. He knew what the infrastructure they depended on looked like and where it failed them and what it would take to repair it. He had spent his career building that knowledge, and at the end of the career, he spent it. The public reaction when the story broke 6 weeks after the transfers were complete was loud and divided in exactly the way that American public reactions to things that cannot be easily categorized tend to be loud and divided. In the financial media ran segments that debated the economic rationality of the decision with the seriousness of people who had never seriously considered that economic rationality might not be the most important category through which to evaluate a human choice. Social media produced the full spectrum. People who called James a saint, and people who called him insane, and people who called him a bad father, and people who called him the only honest billionaire they had ever heard of. And all of these positions attracted followers, and all of them missed something. The television coverage focused almost entirely on the drama of the children's reaction, the 14 months of silence, the legal challenge, the family in turmoil, which was the most cinematically available element of the story and the least important one. What was less covered, partly because it required more patience and more background knowledge to access, was the reaction within the professional world of the people who actually build companies and manage capital. That reaction was quieter and, in its quietness, more revealing. A venture capitalist who declined to be named said, "Every successful person I know carries some version of the debt he was describing. Most of us carry it very comfortably. He is the only person I know of who actually paid it in full. I have been trying to determine for several months whether I find that admirable or whether I find it a rebuke to something I am not prepared to be rebuked about. I have not determined it." A professor of business ethics who wrote about the decision in a peer-reviewed journal described it as the only example she had encountered in her career of what she called terminal accountability. An executive who had, at the one moment when he had complete control over the disposition of the value he had created, applied a standard of accountability to himself that the systems around him would never have required, and that the people who benefited from it had no power to demand. She said the reason the story made people uncomfortable, and it did make people uncomfortable across the political and financial spectrum, was not because it was extreme. It was because it was coherent. It followed, she wrote, from a set of premises that most people claim to hold and almost no one was prepared to act on at the relevant scale. A former colleague of James's, who had worked with him in the company's early years and had since built his own business, said, "James always said the work was for the people the infrastructure served." We all heard that. Most of us filed it under things successful people say. He meant it exactly. We were the ones who were not listening carefully enough. The Harvard Business School case study titled The Calloway Decision was introduced into the curriculum the academic year following the events. It is taught as part of a module on what the course catalog describes as value alignment at exit, the question of what an entrepreneur is obligated to do with the value they have created at the point of its monetization, and to whom that obligation runs. The case presents the facts without argument: the company's history, the sale, the phone call, with the distributions, the legal challenge, the family's response, the recipient profiles, the relevant notebook excerpts. It then asks students a series of questions that the professor who designed the curriculum describes as genuinely unanswerable in any way that produces consensus. The final question, the one the professor says generates the most productive disagreement, is this: if you were in James Calloway's position, with his history, his information, and his concluded reasoning, what would you tell your children? And do you believe that what you told them would be enough? Of the cohorts that have worked through the case, the split has been consistent across every semester since introduction. Approximately 31% of students say yes, 69% say no. The professor says the number has not moved meaningfully. She says this split is not about finance. It is not about law. It is not even about ethics in the abstract. It is about what people believe they owe the world versus what they believe they owe the people who chose to be close to them. And that question divides human beings at a level that is much deeper than any curriculum can reach. The classroom is just where it becomes visible. James Calloway lives now in a town in central Ohio that most people outside the state have never heard of. He rents a house. It is a modest house on a quiet street. He drives a used car. He has, by every observable measure, constructed a life that looks nothing like what a person who once had $340 billion clearing into their accounts might be expected to live. He does consulting work for small nonprofits, organizations working in operational efficiency, technology infrastructure, community resource management, at below market rates. The people who work with him in this capacity have described the experience in terms that are strikingly consistent with how people described working with him 20 years ago at Calloway Systems Group's earliest clients. He listens before he speaks. He asks questions nobody else thinks to ask. He focuses on the people the system is supposed to serve, not the people running the system. He does not perform. He does not seek recognition. He shows up, he works, he leaves. His neighbors on the quiet street know him as a private man who is good at complicated problems and who does not talk about himself. Some of them know who he is. Most apparently do not. He does not seem to mind either way. He has declined every interview request since the story became public. He declined the request submitted for this documentary. He agreed through an intermediary to respond to 3 written questions selected from a list of 10 submitted. He did not respond to the questions about his financial planning process, his legal strategy, his views on wealth concentration, or his relationship with the concept of legacy. He responded to these 3. The first was, "Do you have any regrets?" He wrote, "About the money, no. About how long it took me to arrive at the decision? Yes. Every day, yes." The second was, "What would you say to your children?" He wrote, "I say it to them, not to cameras." The third was, "What do you want people who encounter this story to take from it?" He wrote, "Nothing in particular. I would only ask them to be honest with themselves about what they are carrying, and whether the reason they are still carrying it is as solid as they have been telling themselves it is." 3 written answers. The economy of them is typical of everything that has been documented about how James Calloway communicates. He does not use more words than the question requires. He does not perform. He answers. And then he stops. The trust is the piece of the story that arrived last in the public record nearly 3 years after the distributions, and that required the most significant revision of the narrative that had formed in the interim. An attorney in Cincinnati filed documents related to a trust that had been established in 2008, 14 years before the sale, 6 years before James had first engaged with a separate legal team. So during the middle years of the company's growth, when no one outside James's private thoughts would have had any reason to think about what would eventually happen to $340 billion. The trust had been funded over those 14 years from James's operating salary, not from equity, not from the company's value, but from the regular income he received as its chief executive, in modest and consistent annual contributions that had attracted no particular notice in the ordinary conduct of managing his finances. By the time the trust documents were filed, the total accumulated was $2,300,000. It was divided equally among three beneficiaries. The beneficiaries were Rachel, Daniel, and Marcus. Each would receive their portion on their 45th birthday. When a letter accompanying the trust documents explained the structure, it was a different letter from the 11-page letter delivered to each child on the morning the transfers were complete. Shorter, more specific to the trust's terms, written in James's direct and undecorated prose. He explained the amount. Enough to have options. Not enough to not have to build something yourself. Not enough to avoid the experience of discovering what you are capable of when necessity requires it, but enough to be able to choose what you build and why, rather than being forced by pure financial necessity into whatever was immediately available. He explained the timing. By 45 years old, he wrote, you will know enough about yourself to understand what you actually need and what you will actually do with support of this kind. At 25, I would not have known. At 35, I was still not sure. At 45, I think you will know. I trust you to know by then. He used that word, trust, deliberately, which Rachel noted in one of her limited public comments on the matter. She said, he used the word trust in a document about a trust. I have spent time thinking about whether that was intentional. I believe it was. Rachel will receive her portion in 4 years. She has said in the one comment she has made about the trust since its existence became known, that she is still deciding how she feels about it, that she is grateful for the honesty of the explanation, that she finds the amount both more and less than she expected, without being willing to elaborate on which dimension is which. Daniel received his portion 2 years ago. He has said nothing publicly about it. People close to him say he is doing work he finds meaningful and that he appears to be at peace with a relationship with his father that is complicated and ongoing and not reducible to the events of October the 14th. Marcus is 20 years old. He has 12 years. 12 years inside a story that is also his story, waiting for the part of it that arrives on his 45th birthday, living in the interim with a father who is both famous and invisible, who answered 3 written questions and declined all the others, who lives on a quiet street in central Ohio and does not talk about himself. There is one more document in this story that has not been publicly seen, the 11-page letter. The handwritten letter that James left with his separate legal team to be delivered to each of his 3 children on the morning the transfers were complete. Rachel has confirmed it exists. Daniel has confirmed it exists. Marcus has not spoken about it. Neither Rachel nor Daniel has shared its contents. Rachel made one comment about it in a brief exchange with a journalist at a public event. The journalist asked her what was in the letter. She said, I expected an explanation. What I got was an accounting, not of the money, of everything else. The journalist pressed. She said, I think that is between him and us. I think we are entitled to that much. And she excused herself and walked away. Whatever James wrote in those 11 pages, whatever accounting he offered for the everything else that the money had never been able to account for, near the Tuesday evenings in the hospital at 3 in the morning, and the retirement party in the backyard, and Dorothy Burton's porch and 20 years of not going back, whatever he wrote in those pages is something that 3 people in the world have read and that none of them has chosen to share. That privacy is itself a kind of answer. It says, this is not for you. This is between them. Whatever it costs to write and whatever it costs to carry, it belongs to the people it was written for. And that is the end of that. Now let us come to the part of this story that is actually about you. Not about James Calloway, about you, about the person watching this who has built something or is building something, or who has spent years inside a life organized around the production of a number in an account, and who has, at some point, late at night or early in the morning, or in a parking garage after a meeting where something became clear that you were not expecting to become clear, Ask yourself the question that James asked himself in those notebooks. What is this for? Not what does it fund, not what does it enable, not what does it make possible in some abstracted future that has not arrived yet. What is it for right now in the life you are actually living, with the people who are actually present, toward the actual ends that you are actually moving toward? James Calloway spent 22 years building a company before he was honest enough with himself to answer that question in a way that cost him something. He answered it in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. at 6:14 in the morning, alone in the dark, or after a sleepless night that was also the culmination of 3 years of notebooks. And the answer was $340 billion moving out of an account and into a health clinic in Leslie County and a school district in Mississippi and Sandra's bank account at a time of morning when the rest of Columbus was still asleep. The question he asked, the version of it that belongs to you, that is calibrated to the scale of your life rather than the scale of his, is not about billions. It is not about the specific number in any specific account. It is about what you are carrying and what you are calling it. It is about the gap between what you have told yourself you will do when the time is right and the honest assessment of whether the time has ever been less right than it is right now. And it is about Dorothy Burton's porch and who your version of Dorothy Burton is, and when you last sat on that porch and whether you are still telling yourself you will go back. It is about Harold Calloway on the factory floor for 31 years and who your version of Harold is and whether the debt you owe that person has been paid or deferred or quietly reclassified as something that does not require payment. It is about the voicemail into the empty room and the phone in airplane mode over the flat dark of the Midwest and what you would say if you had to say it now into a room where no one was listening. It is about all of those things, and none of those things require $340 billion. They require something harder. They require honesty, the kind of honesty that costs something. The kind James spent 3 years in those notebooks working up to. The kind that his daughter is still, by her own account, working toward. James Calloway is in his early 60s. He is on a quiet street in central Ohio. He gets up in the mornings and he does work that he has described in 3 written words as work I can look at. He has no press office. He has no foundation bearing his name. He has no legacy institution. He has a used car and a rented house and 3 adult children who are each, in their own way and on their own timeline, figuring out what they think about a father who did something that none of them asked for, and all of them are still processing. He has a daughter who is deciding how she feels about a trust payment arriving in 4 years. He has a son who received his trust payment 2 years ago and has not said a word about it publicly, which in its own way is the most James-like response possible. He has a 20-year-old son who has 12 years and an entire relationship with this story still ahead of him. He has 27 composition notebooks that are stored somewhere that no one outside a small circle of attorneys knows exactly where. He has a health clinic in Leslie County that is still open and has expanded twice. He has Sandra's daughter in Dallas who remembers what her mother's voice sounded like on a Thursday morning in November when she called from the floor of her kitchen and said someone remembered that I was there. That is what $340 billion became. That is the full accounting, not the number in the account, which was the proxy. The thing the proxy was always pointing toward, the clinic, the school, the research. Sandra on the kitchen floor. Dorothy Burton's porch paid for in a way that was 35 years late and the only time it was ever going to arrive. Harold Calloway's 31 years honored in the only way James could think of that was proportionate to what they were worth. The voicemail into the empty room answered finally, not with words into another room where no one was listening, but with $340 billion moving into the world in the direction of the people who needed it. That is the answer James Calloway gave to the question his father asked him at the door of the dormitory in 1979. Make it count. It took him 40 years, but he answered it. And he answered it in a way that no one who was watching him answer it, not his attorneys, not his children, not his bankers, not the business press, not the Harvard students who have been arguing about it every semester since, has been able to stop thinking about. Because the answer he gave is also a question. And the question is for everyone who has ever stood at the door of something they built, holding something they worked for, asking themselves what it is for, and whether the answer they have been giving is the honest one. Rachel Calloway, at the end of the one interview she has given, was asked what she wants for her father. Not what she thinks of his decision, not whether she agrees with it, what she wants for him. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the journalist who conducted the interview later noted it in writing as an unusual silence, even by the standards of a conversation that had contained several unusual silences. Then she said, "I want him to be right. I want the whole thing to have been worth what it cost. Because if it was worth what it cost, if Sandra's daughter in Dallas felt what I think she felt when her mother called her from the floor of that kitchen, if the clinic in Leslie County saves the lives I believe it will save, if Dr. Morris's research goes where I think it might go in 10 years, then what my father did is something I will be proud of. It will not replace what I felt in that parking garage. It will not undo 14 months of silence or the conversation with the attorneys that I was not prepared for, but it will sit alongside all of that. And eventually, I think the pride will be louder than the anger. I think. I need more time." She paused again. Then she said quietly and without drama, with the precision of someone who has said a true thing, "I think I will get there." James Calloway, for his part, is already there. He has been there since 6:20 and 40 seconds in the morning on a Tuesday in October, when the call to Thomas Reardon ended, and he put the phone down and sat in the hotel room in the early morning light of Washington, D.C., with nothing in his accounts and everything in its right place. He is there on the quiet street in Central Ohio. He is there in the used car and the rented house and the below-market consulting work and the life that looks, from the outside, like subtraction. But that is, from the inside, Warren, by his own account, delivered in 3 written answers, exactly what it was always supposed to become. He did not keep anything. He is not carrying anything. He is, as near as anyone can determine from the outside of a life that is genuinely private, at peace with the answer he gave to the question his father asked him. Make it count. He made it count. In a hotel room at 6:14 in the morning, in 6 minutes and 40 seconds, in $340 billion finding the people it was always meant to find, in Sandra on the kitchen floor saying someone remembered that I was there, in Leslie County, in a school in Mississippi, in Dr. Angela Morris's lab, in Notebook 23, and the sentence about the proxy and the decision to stop spending it. In a sheet of paper in an envelope delivered to 3 addresses on a morning in October, 11 pages long, an accounting of everything the money could not account for. He made it count. From a dormitory door in Columbus, Ohio, in 1979, to a hotel room in Washington, D.C., 40 years later. He made it count. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. That means something. These stories take time to tell, and they take time to hear, and the fact that you are still here says something about the kind of person you are and the kind of questions you are willing to sit with. We would love to hear from you now. Drop a comment below and tell us where you landed on this. Was James right or was he wrong? Tell us what you would have done with $340 billion and tell us whether your answer surprised you. Tell us if there is something you are carrying that this story made you think about in a different way. Tell us if you have a herald in your life and whether the debt has been paid. These comment sections are genuinely some of the best conversations that happen anywhere on this platform, and we read every single one of them, and they matter to us more than we can easily say. And before you go, please let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We love hearing from this community, whether you are in Ohio or Texas or Georgia or California or anywhere else in the world. And if you have not already hit that subscribe button, please do it now, because the next story we are going to tell is one you don't want to miss. We will see you then.